Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. Now, in some recent beadbox acquisitions, I've been lucky enough to receive some beautiful floral beads. So I'm working with roses today, but you could work with any flower bead that is single-sided. What I found with these is if you put them into your beaded projects, quite often they can spin around. So I wanted to create a design that could be used as earrings, charms, dangly pendants even, and add a little bit of detail to that floral charm and prevent that flower bead from spinning around. So get yourself down to the board and we'll have a closer look at this project. So this is an example of the type of bead I'm referring to. So it's beautifully detailed rose on one side and a flat design on the reverse. Very, very beautiful and high attention to detail. However, when you put them on wire or threading material, they can spin around. It's great if you're wearing it on the wrist, you can just allow it to sit correctly. But if you pop that on the bottom of a head pin, it can just spin around and show you the slightly less interesting side. So I'm going to show you how to turn one of those and some wire into one of these. So it's a rose accent pendant or charm, and we're going to be using 2 gauges of wire today. My favourite Desert Island 2, which is 1mm or 18 gauge, and 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire. So that's what we're going to be working towards, and this is what we're going to be creating with. So to begin with, I have an 8-inch length of that 1mm. And what we're going to do is give that a really good warm through. Get that nice and smooth and toasty. And we're going to start around about 5 inches from one end. And I'm going to put a right angle bend in. So the shorter end is going to become the core wire that goes up and creates the loop or bail at the top. And the longer end is going to be the leaf design that we're going to work. So the warmer your wire is at this stage, the better. However, if you work with a very soft wire, you may not end up with the easiest piece of wire work to weave onto. So I thoroughly recommend a medium type of wire, not too soft, but we'll make it warm so that what we can do is use the curvature of our thumb to just generate a lovely sort of arcing swoosh shape. And you can see I'm even using my nail just to get a little bit more curvature in, and then I'm going to turn the wire back the other way to put a little bit of a point on the end. What we're going to do then is use our flat pliers, or chain nose pliers in this instance, across the wire. And I'm going to draw that quite sharply back on itself. Now you can make these little leaf designs symmetrical, but I quite like them to be asymmetrical. So where we've got a little bit of a dint in that curve on the one side, I'm going to just go for a complete curve on the other side. So putting a little bit of intention of warmth into the wire at this stage is really helpful, and then the wire can just swoosh around and give you that accenting leaf shape. Now before we wrap any further, I'm going to show you I've left a bit of a gap up at the top, although that wire path does cross over the angle change. The next wire we're going to use is 0.4mm gauge wire, but we're going to use a length of wire that is not cut. So I'm going to use this off the reel. I'm working with a copper colour wire and a gold colour copper wire, and the wire I'm adding in now is 0.4mm gauge, and that is equivalent to 26 gauge. So when you're working with a finer gauge wire, you don't really want to condition it by running your thumb and forefinger over it, otherwise you can make it a little bit too brittle. So I'm going to pop around about 1/2 inch just over the whole of that heavier wire to begin with, and I'm going to use my pliers to generate a 3 wrap spiral around the base of that accenting leaf design. So it's much easier to do just by hand. The reason I'm using my tool is because it means I don't move everything around quite so much on the camera. So I'm going to wrap that around for a 3rd time. You can just push that into position. Now you can see I've made a very, very open little spiral there. We need this to be as tight as possible every time we wrap. So I'm just going to bring that tail up and through, make sure that that spiral is super tight, and then just trim away that last little bit on the end. What I'm looking for in this design is to have the very cut end of the wire to be inside that frame before I push that all the way down to the tip that we created. Now you can make that a little bit sharper if you want to, just by pinching it together at the end. But that's an aesthetic value that you can decide for yourself. What we're looking to do is to have really tight coils of wire wrapping on either side of this design. So if you look, you will see that my finer gauge wire is coming off the top of the right hand side as we're looking at it, and I want that to be going down the centre of the leaf, hence we left that little gap so you can wrap in between. Let's re-sight that back down at the base now, and what we're going to do is to wrap a figure of 8 weave. Now it's a little bit harder to hold and show you than it is to actually achieve. All we're doing is we're wrapping 3 times on one side, switching over, so the finer gauge wire is on the top on this side, so I want to take the tail that is attached to the reel down the centre and go underneath the other side. Now the reason we left a little bit of a gap here is so that we can take that tail that's attached to the reel and bring that all the way around. Now every time I do a single wrap I'm going to scooch this down, because if you don't get the tension right to begin with, your weaving doesn't have that lovely neat appearance. So I'm going to wrap 3 times around this side of the design, and every time I do a single wrap I'm going to push that all the way down, make sure there's tension. It is very easy to do, it is slightly more tricky to show because you have to hold the design quite still. Push that all the way down to the bottom and give it a scooch to tighten it. Now I tend to flip this around quite a lot when I'm weaving, and I'm trying to keep it as still as possible for the camera to follow. So because I have wrapped 3 times around the second side, the wire is coming off the top, so I've taken it down the middle to go underneath the other side. So you're always switching from one side to the other. So I'm going to wrap once and then twice, scooch that wire down, and then a 3rd time. So you can see I'm bringing the tail down inside that gap, bring it nice and taut, and then I can flip the whole thing around, draw the wire down the centre and up underneath on the opposite side. So when your finer gauge wire leaves one of those edges, it's always on top, goes down the middle, flips around 3 times on the opposite side, it's returned to the top side, goes down the middle. So you're just going to continue until you get across the widest point of this design. So we're going to continue weaving in that figure of 8 weave until we get to the widest point. Every time you've completed those 3 little wraps, just scooch the wire down with your nail to give it some lovely tension, and then we'll meet again and continue from there. The key with this design, as with much wire wrapping and wire weaving, is tension. So we're looking to maintain the path of the tail of wire as it crosses over that angle to make sure that we keep the leaf or the accent in the form that we're looking to end up with. If you're working with very soft wire, this can move around quite a lot. The second thing to note is that every time you've done your 3 little wraps on either side, scooch that wire down firmly. The harder you push down to compress that spiral, the neater and slightly more machined looking your weaving will be. If it starts to open up and become baggy, it just doesn't look quite as nice, so give that a scooch down. As you start to get past the widest point, it becomes a little trickier to get those weaves to stay where you put them. So the reason I've stopped part the way along is to show you how to overcome that. We've got our finer gauge wire still attached to the reel and it's come down the centre as it always does, and I'm just allowing that to sit underneath the side at the moment. What I'm going to do is to pull in this direction to keep the existing weaving in position, and I'm going to wrap once around that second side, and then I'm going to pull the tail of wire away from me in the direction that I want the tension to travel. So you can see that's already put a little bit more tension in that wrap, and it's keeping everything neat and tidy. So you can loop around again, pull that wire back in that same orientation, give it another scooch, and then bring that wire over the top and down the centre. So we've got our 3 wraps on that second side. We're going to just tighten everything up, and then I'm going to pinch the whole thing between thumb and forefinger, making sure that my finer gauge wire is only ever one layer of wire thick. I'm not allowing that wire to cross over any of the preceding wraps. I'm going to pull that very firmly into position whilst I wrap again around the side that we're working on and pull the wire down towards where the existing weaving occurs. If you pull too hard, what can happen is that this second side will lift up and you'll shorten that distance. Before you go any further, if you pull both sides down into position, you can just give that a little bit of a lengthen by undoing your last wrap, and everything should come back into position. Just doing one wrap at a time and assessing the situation every time you do a wrap. So I'm going to look, there's a bit of a gap, so I'm just going to push everything into position, checking that that pass of wire is still going across the angle where I want it to, and then we'll go for that third wrap. Draw the tail of the wire down towards me, compress each of those wraps. So you can do the first half when you're increasing the distance between those wraps quite quickly. On the downward slope, when you're decreasing that distance, you will need to go just a little bit more slowly. So it's very easy to accidentally bring the wire across without ensuring that you get that nice tight look. So just take your time and it will all come together. So I'm going to just pinch that into position, draw the wire all the way around and pull that up towards the existing wraps. Just fill that all the way along and we'll meet back here in a second. So once you've reached the top of this section, you can cut away your wire after completing 3 wraps on really either side of the frame. It doesn't matter one bit. What we're going to do is just give that a bit of a pinch, make sure we're happy with the overall shape, and then we're going to warm through the tail that's coming off on one side. Give that a really good warm to make it nice and fluid. Just push your wire down if it's started to creep up a little bit, and we'll draw that all the way around the core wire one time, and then bring it just over the front slightly. Now this can be a little bit tricky to get tight, so what I'm going to do is just push that down very, very gently to make sure that it's really close to the top of that little accent leaf design. And then I'm going to warm it through again, because that action we've just taken will have already started to work hard on your wire. Give that a really good toasty warm, and then just allow that to scooch out slightly to the right. Draw it back across the middle of your leaf form, push that down on top of your weaving, and then draw the tail so that it goes over that point down at the base of the design. Now you can play around with how much wiggle you put in this, it's entirely up to you. You could indeed go for a little bit more of a straight line, but I really like this design to have a little bit of angularity to it, a little bit of smoothness to it. So what we're going to do now is flip that over to the rear of the design, grab our cutters and trim away to around about, I would say that's probably 1/4 inch or so, just slightly less. Let's get that out of the way. And then using any of your flat facing pliers, I'm using my bent chain nose pliers, I'm going to start that moving around over the tip of the leaf accent design. So just pull that gently so that you've got it still in position over the pointed part, and then we're just going to very, very slowly bring the very tip of that wire, making sure you cut with the flush side, and then just crimp that down into position. So once you flip that over, you might want to take a second just to ensure that that tail section is hidden behind the line of wire on the front, and then just ensure that that's down nice and flat. You can give it a little bit of a gentle squish, but nothing too serious, because we don't want to harm the remainder of that wire. So you can cut the wire really short and just make a very, very simple, either a simple loop or a wrapped loop up at the top, and you've got a lovely charm. These make great additions to extender chains if you're making a flora and fauna inspired necklace, for instance, or just very, very simple little earrings, charms on bracelets, so on and so forth. But if you want to see how to use the floral bead that would otherwise spin, I'll show you how to accent that with your leaf design now. So there's the little accent just as a tiny charm all by itself, but we're going to slide on the floral bead. I think this one is made out of clay. Bring that down to sit in position. Now you may find that one direction will sit slightly better than the other, so you can just take that off and recite it rather if you need to, but I'm just going to push that down into position so that it looks really, really pretty. And then we're going to support the rose in its final position and just bring the wire forwards up at the top and create a little wrapped loop. Now the reason I've pulled that wire forwards and there's a gap between the drill exit point, it means that I can just push that ever so slightly backwards and we can hide our little wrapped loop a little bit later. So I'm going to use my memory wire pliers now to create a small loop up at the top, and I'm putting it at 90 degrees to the leaf and the flower so that I could use this as a pendant if I wanted to. It will work equally well as a charm or earrings, whatever you fancy. So I've got that first little round shape going. Draw that all the way around. Now this is the issue that I have with these beads. They're absolutely beautiful, but they do spin. So what we're going to do is to stop that from happening. Just gently pulling that slightly backwards, and we will recite that in a second. Grip across your circular form and make that little wrapped loop. Now you can go 1 or 2 times depending on how much space you've got, but it does need to be quite tight. Once that is sitting neatly, just tighten up your coil, make sure that you're happy with how that looks. We're really looking just to be able to see the top of that loop out of the top of the flower, and we've already pretty much set it by the nature of tension. However, we have this excess of wire now, which is about 1.25 inches, so I'm just going to bring that down to around about 1 inch, trim that away and get the excess into the scrap pot. Using your round nose pliers, or in this instance my little memory wire pliers, I'm going to start to create a coil. It can be quite a large open centre. And if you've got about 1 inch of a wire, bearing in mind we're using 18 gauge or 1mm, you should get pretty much a double spiral, but I'm going to leave that open and just bring that down on the rear side of that flower bead, push it against the back and just gently draw that loop into position. In that way, your flower bead no longer spins, but you've accented it with your little wire work accent down at the bottom. Despite the fact that my 2 accented rose designs are in different coloured wire combinations, I'm probably still going to make those into earrings. I just love how you can do something that's useful, so to stop those flowers from spinning, but also do something that's really pretty and decorative. I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Bye for now.